It's not so much the stress and the pressure and the disappointment, the embarrassment, but it's the heartbreak that comes from your adult child not speaking to you, not taking your calls, not answering your emails, not giving you an address where they are. I've had so many parents tell me that they have no idea where their children are and they don't even know where to begin to look. Dealing with the stress, dealing with the embarrassment of parental estrangement, which is where a child, an adult child, may choose not to have contact with the parent, is very stressful. It's heartbreaking. And so when I set about this journey to help other parents through this, moms especially, it was important to me to not just talk about the emotional aspect of it, but also the aspect of, I guess I can say, the societal um, aspect of it. Whereas you have to try and address the absence of your child, your adult child, to people who may ask you, well, how is, so and so doing? And it's, I don't know. What more embarrassing um, thing could there be than for a parent to not know where their child is, right? And, people who haven't experienced estrangement or people who don't have adult children will tell you, well, you know, it must be something that you've done, right? It must be something, you must be a horrible parent, right? And I hear that a lot with parents, with moms. And even online, when I come across accounts where moms are being very transparent about their experience with parental estrangement, and I see, excuse me, I see, them struggle with explaining to commenters exactly how they wound up in this situation. And sometimes we wind up in these situations as moms because it's something we've caused, right? It has something to do with how we raised our children, neglect, abuse, um, being estranged or being, estranged from our child due to divorce, especially if the ex gets custody of the child. I've seen that be a huge factor in parental estrangement. Um, it also has been a huge factor having your adult child grow up and an absent parent that wasn't there now turns that blame onto the custodial parent, right? Instead of them taking accountability for their absence, they make up lies about the other parent, and now the other parent is stuck in this horrible nightmare because the other parent wouldn't be accountable. Sometimes that comes to the light, right? We've seen that happen many times on these social media apps where we catch a video of, I think it was about 2, 3 months ago, where a mom had estranged her children from their father. Alienated, parental alienation, had alienated her children from their father by making up stories that there was sexual abuse, right? And then it was on Unaliving, and then having to come to terms with what she'd done instead of apologizing and owning that. She said, you should have fought harder, right? And so I'm going to be very blunt when I say instances like that make it very hard for us as moms, right? Especially those of us who are estranged from our children, and living that in a very open and public way, especially with social media. It makes it very difficult, especially when you've been a mom that, like I was pretty hands-on with my children in football and track and basketball and dance and all those things, right? And on top of working and coming to terms with our parenting wasn't enough, right? And although I can take accountability for how many hours I worked so much, right? And even though that was outside of my control, it was necessary for us to live. It still, it was about me coming to a place in my mind to see it from my children's point of view, that even though it was something that couldn't be helped, it still had an impact, right? And so a lot of times when we have, adult children, it takes some time before they get to understand the perils of parenting and the struggle to divide your time between a full-time job, in which I work two jobs, a full-time and a part-time. It takes some time to get to a place where you can really fully embrace what a parent may have went through, right? I'm quite sure there's some of you out there, I'm a Gen Xer, that, like me, realized after I became a parent how much goes into parenting, how much of our energy and resources go into parenting. And so sometimes our adult children can get out in the world and they can, meet other young people who didn't have the similar experiences that they did as young people. I know for me, my children went off and, went to college, got a start on their own as adults, met other people who had moms who were stay-at-home moms, and they had families who were two-parent families. And so there was this belief system that it was a choice for me to, become a single parent willingly and without consideration to their well-being, right? And so, you know, that was very difficult. And I see that a lot with moms, especially single moms who had to leave very serious situations. In my case, it was extreme domestic violence. And so you can have a parent who can, an ex-parent, and an ex-spouse rather, who can take that and turn that in a way that it benefits them, excuses their absence. And so in my case, my ex-husband decided he wasn't going to see the children if I divorced him. And so 7 years he didn't see them. And even then it was inconsistent. And so we as the parent, we can take the bulk of the blame for how difficult of a life that can be, right? And knowing that we made the right decision, knowing why we made that decision, and that it was about preservation of ourselves, right? Or of our family and the well-being of our children. A very difficult decision to make. And that can be used against you, right? And I think the most painful part of that and of estrangement for me was knowing that the things that were, coming up for me and my children were things that could not have been avoided. Things that I did my best to handle with the limited amount of resources I had, the limited amount of information that I had, and doing it all on my own. So coming to terms with that and having this belief system for years that I had put 110% into my parenting and changing toxic generational patterns and protecting them from things that I experienced as a young person at the hands of people who I trusted, right? And so that made it very difficult for me as a parent to tell someone, I don't know how my child is doing. I haven't heard from them. They don't talk to me. And in one of the instances for me, my adult child was not telling the rest of the family that they weren't speaking to me. And so they would navigate the family and attend family functions, and people would say, well, oh, I saw so-and-so, and they look so good, and they're doing so good, and they're working. And I saw the baby, and I had never met my grandbaby. And so all I could say was, well, yeah, so and so's not talking to me. And then it's like, well, they were saying that everything was fine and they love you. And, that was very difficult. And I don't think there's a um, words in the human language that can explain what that feels like. That's very painful. And so to not have any feedback for why, so that you can at least fix it. And I noticed that that is a lot of what I get from parents when people reach out to me in my DMs or in my comments, and they say, I don't know what happened. They just stopped talking to me. And so I think it was about 6 years ago when I came across a term called ghosting. And after I went through parental estrangement, me and my husband were talking about, my now husband, were talking about it. And I said, this feels a lot like what I read online is called ghosting, where your child talks to you and then all of a sudden just fades to black and doesn't say anything. And so I came to the conclusion that social media plays a huge part in that, because children are able to keep an eye on their parents. They're able to see what they're doing. They're able to talk to other family members or follow other family members' pages in order to see how their parents are doing. So it's a cheat code. They're able to exact just the right amount of pain on the parent with their estrangement and still know if their parent is doing okay, while the parent is left in this state of constant peril and not knowing if someone is okay. And imagine how embarrassing that is, to have to call up another family member and say, hey, have you seen so-and-so? Or I'm not sure, I've been trying to reach so-and-so and I can't get through. Have you seen them? For me, it was easier because I had my other adult children to reach out to at various times when there was one of them that decided that they didn't want to talk or they didn't want to be bothered. But there were times where they hadn't heard from their sibling, and that made it very difficult. And so when I talk to you about embarrassment and the lethal amount of embarrassment that parents go through, and I had no idea the amount of parents that have unalived themselves as a result of parental estrangement, until I started this platform and started talking to other parents who knew parents who had taken their own lives. And when I hear about that, I can remember the amount of severe emotional pain that I experienced as a parent. And I just, I don't want to seem judgmental, but I think because I had my husband there who understood, who knew the type of parent that I was, who parented with me for what? We've been together almost 17 years. My oldest son was 17 when we got together. And he's now in his 30s. I think he's 33, 33, 34. I lose track of all of them. But, that's a pretty long time to be in someone's life. And so for us to have parented together and to, have seen the amount of resources that I put into parenting, and we knew each other prior to dating, and I was in school, so everyone knew the amount of sacrifices I was putting my body and my mind through by working 2 jobs and going to school and having 4 children. And so I think it made it easier for me. And I never want to be that person that says that could never be me, because with God, there before the grace of God go I, right? And so when we are talking about these issues, these family issues, family dynamics that are and can be very painful, it's important that we understand that parents are people too. Parents are people with emotions, people who have feelings, and that regardless to the level of blame that that parent, is responsible for, that is still a person. And that was one of the most challenging issues that I ran up against as I started this platform and I navigated through spaces on social media, especially in Clubhouse and on Twitter, in which there's a lot of judgment and a lot of people can become easily hostile. The amount of people that became hostile, my DMs, and that's how I was able to discover that both on Instagram and on Clubhouse, there's a whole other there's a whole other mailbox, right? Of people who don't follow you or you don't follow them. I don't remember how it goes, but it's a mailbox that, and I think it's on Twitter too. Twitter, it's a mailbox on there too, that your mail can go to and you don't even know, right? And so when I came across that, I was like, the amount of vitriol and the amount of blame and people who don't know your story and know nothing about you and make these extreme accusations. And I came to realize that a lot of it comes from the fact that people have wounds. And a lot of times, people who aren't able to have a conversation with the parent will reach out. And you become that target. And you become well, you probably did something to your kids and you're a shitty parent and person, and that's why they don't want to deal with you. And you guys, you parents and boomers. I've been called a boomer. Yeah. So, so it's been a journey. And so when I think about the societal pushback for parents, and especially black mothers, there is something about the lack of compassion for black mothers that is astronomically distressing. Um, I've seen on Facebook many of Facebook groups filled with white women, and they're on there and they're talking and they're leaning into each other for what's happening, right? And occasionally through the comments you'll see a little here and there someone gets through, but overall there's this level of compassion. Oh, you did your best and you were trying, and that things just happen sometimes, and there's that support system there. And when it's a black mother, I realize I see so much vitriol for us online. It's well, we have the example of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson about a week ago, where she was having the hearing for her to see if she was capable or qualified, a woman who is overqualified, more qualified than any candidate they've ever presented to the Supreme Court. And they were just brutally blaming her for things that had nothing to do with her. And as I sat and I watched that, my heart broke. And my heart breaks still for us as black mothers. The amount and the challenges that we are put through, and the unsolicited hate that is pushed our way. You are a horrible mother. You are this, you are that. There's no shortage of the ugly adjectives that can be thrown our way. And without the benefit of even having the information of how we arrived at a very troubling and emotionally painful place of not having contact with our children. I've covered also, and I'm thinking about 2 or 3 videos before this one. I've covered how systemic and structural racism plays a part in parental estrangement, and especially for Black mothers, and how many of us, me being a Gen Xer, we happened to come up at a point where we were watching the war on drugs. We were watching incarceration at record rates. I happen to be a product of Watts, California, proud member. Uh, we're on the border of Watts and South Central, closer to Watts, so that's my home. That's what I claim. But you know, I was that mom who experienced going back and forth to the jailhouse to visit my ex-husband, and him trying to find his footing as a young Black man in America, and you know, just getting trapped into that whole system and going into the prison industrial complex, and the impact that had on our family as he struggled with addiction and many other things. And instead of getting the resources he needed, he was incarcerated. And it just created more suffering for him and put him in a place where he was pretty much at a loss. Once you've been incarcerated, you have a record. It's difficult for you to navigate this place without extreme difficulty. And the challenges he faced with his own childhood and being a victim of domestic violence himself, and that passing on through the generations, and him struggling with domestic violence himself and within our family, and the extreme impact that had on our family of violence and pain and suffering. And so you look at that, and I don't know how people cannot factor in how systemic and structural racism plays a part in the destruction of our families, and how it can tear them apart, and the impact that it has on children that vibrates for generations to come. And it's one of the factors that we are blamed for. Oh, well, you're looking for an easy way out, right? So that embarrassment of, this used to be my life, right? Living the way I had to in a survival mode, and taking care of our children, and making a way out of no way, and no resources for us within our communities. And meaning that, you know, a parent has to work 2 and 3 jobs to be able to, you know, afford a place to live for their children. And for me, it was at that time working a full-time job, right, as a contractor, and then working another job as a part-time job because it provided full-time benefits. And so that meant working from 7:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., going home, taking care of my children, checking in with them, making sure they've eaten, they've done their homework, clothes and things are ready for school, and then leaving there, running into, I lived in Inglewood, California at the time, and making my way to ITT Technical Institute in Gardena, which is on the border of Torrance, California, which was be about a 40-minute trip from my home, going to class until 10, 11 o'clock at night, leaving there, going home, checking on the kids, taking a power nap, because that's about the extent of it, and getting up and reporting for my job at UPS, where I loaded air containers with packages. And that's, if anyone knows what that type of work is, it's very labor intensive work. And I would have my business suit in a cleaner's bag, and my manager there understood that I worked a full-time job as a contractor for guests. I worked as an analyst and for guests, where I did all of the, I worked in the sales division for guests. So all of the clearances that you saw, their guest outlets and all that, that was us. We worked there and made sure that we updated the prices, the pricing, look for trends, it was a lot. And so that was mentally labor intensive. So my daytime job required a lot of focus and a lot of mental stamina, and then my nighttime job required physical stamina. And so leaving the job at UPS, where I worked from 12 to sometimes 6, 7 in the morning, and that was not during the holiday rush. Holiday rush, it was juggling my boss so that I could leave and, hurry up, and my coworkers and I, they understood. So it was times I snuck off so that I can get to work. And it became a challenge where I explained to my boss for my full-time job during the day that I couldn't, I could not be late sometimes. My second job required me to stay until complete. And so I was asked to make a choice. And that's why I said, well, are you going to give me full-time benefits? And, well, we can't do that. You're a contractor. And I said, well, I can't leave my second job. And so I was told I had to make a choice. And so making that choice meant I had to leave my first full-time job during the day and keep my part-time during the evening, meaning now I was left to look for another full-time job. So that meant a lot of times I was in between my full-time jobs as a contractor. And it worked for me because on the weekends, I was able to, on every week, I was able to get a paycheck. And so it helped me to be able to stay on top of the bills, the daycare fees, and all of that. And I wasn't getting child support. And so I didn't get child support until my son was my son was 17, and it was $75 a month for 3 boys. And he turned 17 that November. And I started getting child support that October. And when he turned 17 in November, they stopped sending child support for him. So the $75 dropped to 40 something. It was crazy. It was crazy. And so anyway, I use that as an example of the amount of systemic and structural systems in place that create suffering, that create want, that create need and necessity for mothers to be out here on the grind and doing what they have to in order to support their families. And what that does is it can create a level of resentment from our children as they grow older, because they come across, there's more exposure, especially if your children are going to go off to college, right? At the university level, they go off to school. They meet other children whose parents didn't have the same story as we did. And then there becomes this level of awareness like, well, my parents really fucked up. Excuse me, and I don't mean to be crass, but that's what it comes across as. And so my parents really didn't have their shit together, and it caused me to live a life that was very hard. Being homeless, my children and I have lived in homeless shelters until I could get my feet under me again. I didn't have the supportive family. And so that meant I had to find a way and make a way out of no way. And that was not always easy. And so it becomes an embarrassment on that factor as well, because how do you explain that to people, especially for me, where I was going into corporate settings and working my ass off, and people were seeing me as a model employee, not understanding the fullness of what I was carrying on my shoulders, not understanding that I'm taking calls in the bathroom on my lunch break. I'm sneaking off during lunchtime, rushing to get my kids from school because it's a storm, and I don't want them to have to walk in the rain and possibly a car not see them and hurt my children. And so I would sneak off during my lunchtime and rush to pick my children up from Century City, California, all the way to Westchester and to get my children from school, get them to home in Inglewood, praying that they didn't find out that my children and I have had to move from Westchester to Inglewood. And it was just a very stressful time in our lives. So when my children started to bring that up, that was very painful, because although I understood that this was me doing the best I could with what I was given and what I had and the choices I'd made, I'm not going to say that I didn't take any accountability for that. I became a young mom very early. I was 17 when I got married. And 18, I got married on my 18th birthday. And so we were young and we had a family very early. And so that was, that became my children's story. And it's easy to, as the parent, to only see our side of it, right? Because we know the internal workings of what truly goes on. We understand, and well, I didn't understand the systems that were at play and in place. I just knew I had to take care of my family by any means necessary. And that meant that physically I had to put myself through some things so that I can make that happen. And so without understanding the systems in place as a result of that, it made it difficult to embrace that was the reality, that now the very thing that I had worked my ass off for, to give the good things to my children, take them on vacation, have them in a good neighborhood where they could go to the best schools, now that was going to be used as a weapon. And to have to tell people that, there were times when my children were home with no babysitter because I couldn't afford to pay daycare. I couldn't trust that anybody could just watch them due to some childhood traumas I had of my own. The fear was there that my children could be harmed, and I felt like home was the safest place for them. And so all those things came to a head in parental estrangement. And that was a very painful and difficult reality. And so to the level of embarrassment that came from that, there's no way to explain it. There's just no way to have anyone to understand how that feels. You have to experience that. And to this day, I cannot put words to those emotions. And so when I talk about embarrassment, when I, opened, or when I decided to do this video about the level of embarrassment that as mothers we experience by having to say, I don't know where my child is, and I don't know why they won't speak to me, and I don't know why they won't give me an opportunity to, explain, or why they, and for me, I'm going to be very honest with you, I was so angry. Oh my God, the initial emotion was pain and emotional turmoil. And then it became, I can't believe this, right? My children are old enough. They were there with me. They saw how hard I worked. They saw what I went through. How could they arrive at a place where they can justify punishing me by not talking to me, by not letting me know if they're okay, knowing how much when I tell you I lived for my children, I did not know what it was to have a grown-up outing until well into their teen years. And even then, the longest I had been away from my children was overnight. And that was so rare. And so to look back on those years and know that I opted out of the vacations and the cruises with all the coworkers and friends I had, and then people kept saying, and what was crazy, a lot of my friends didn't have children. And it made sense later on, because coming from where I grew up, that was not as common. But as I navigated more into the corporate setting and met more women my age, and I was surprised to find out how many women did not have children yet. And so they didn't understand, the limitations that I faced. I couldn't just up and go on a cruise for a week for a vacation or a weekend cruise or go off to Mexico and, just and live it up. And so when I looked, that was the most painful thing for me. It was that I had sacrificed so much. And I just didn't understand how it was possible that my sons who had been there with me through all of that didn't see that, and how my daughter, which she was the youngest of them, was able to see that, and she was young and she understood. But I also tell people that she didn't get to go through the most difficult parts of my life, because when she came along, I had pretty much mastered the art of getting down to one job. I learned the power of negotiation, and so I was able to keep one job. And then during that time, my husband now came into our life. She was 4. And so there was 2 incomes in the house. And there was another parent in the house, and he was full-time parenting and with me, and he was available. And there's a difference in the amount of well-being and nurturing environment that can happen as a result sometimes, because it's not always the case. But in our case, that it created more time with another adult, so that when I couldn't be there, or if I didn't get home in time, my husband was able to get home, and he was able to fill in at the times where I would have to run, or if he couldn't get in home, I could pick up the slack. And so it made it different. And so I understood that. And that's why I say to people, do not measure your parenting according to each child, because each child can have a different experience with you. You can, one child can require way more of your time than another child can, and then the other children can, as a result, feel like, they didn't get enough of your time. And that happens, especially when you have multiple children. Excuse me, I'll have a little water. And so it's just no way for a parent to say, well, I was the same parent to all of my children. I don't understand why it's one that doesn't want to deal with me and everybody else does. Well, that one child may have had a different parenting experience with you, because maybe you were more, you had to give more attention to another one of the siblings. And that happens. It happened in my case too, where I needed to give more time. I was spending more time at the school with one child who had a learning disability. And that meant a lot of time back and forth on IEP meetings, fighting. If you're a parent who has a child who has a disability, you understand the level of energy that you have to put into fight to get the resources for them. And that meant for me, a lot of times when the resources within the school system wasn't working, I had to hire outside people to help with my, child. And that meant I had to put in way more hours to afford that. And that's what I mean when I say systemic and structural racism. That should not be the case. And that happens often in our communities. And so I don't want to get off more into that in a tangent. I have plenty of time for that. I have a lot to discuss about that, and how systemic and structural racism destroys our families and creates suffering. And so thank you so much for stopping in and listening to my life story. And I'm hoping that it served you in some way. And if you're a mom who's navigating parental estrangement right now, I'm hoping that you'll join this community that I'm building. I support moms who are navigating parental estrangement, who are more than likely empty nesters, by prioritizing your accountability, your healing, your self-care, and a commitment to lifelong learning. Because I know that there's no way I could have managed to get through this without the amount of information and research that I had to do in order to keep my sanity. in order to pull myself back from the throes of severe and disabling depression. And I'll be talking about that too as the video series continues through the summer. I have some really good things I want to share with you, and I'm hoping to be able to pull in professionals who do this thing, because I can't help you on the mental health side of it. I can tell you my life journey and what worked for me, but I'm not versed in how to, that's something that I'll leave to the professionals. But I'm here as support. I'm here to build community, to build a safe space for us to be, a safe and brave space, because although many of us here may not have been the reason that, our children estranged from us, it may have been how we had to, live, and how we had to work hard. And that's hard. That even though that was not your intention, that's the reality, and that it did have a horrible effect on your family. And that's hard. And to be amongst people who understand and who are able to stand shoulder to shoulder with you and say, you can get through this, and you can find your way, and you'll find the light again. That matters a lot. And I'm hoping to give that to you here in this community. So again, thank you for staying this long, and I hope to see you again. Bye for now.